Alexander 4, August 15th, 922,501,024 AD through ad infinitum. Alexander watched helplessly. His experience of the progression of time had slowed to a near halt. Once he'd activated his device, the effects were immediate. In the time it would take him to move an inch, the whole process would be done. His thoughts, his mind somehow pervaded this restriction, and he remained fittingly imprisoned in his perpetually frozen state, forced to witness the cataclysm he had wrought in real time, his former rate of time, and with no chance at commanding his machine to stop or reverse the process, not that it could have been undone. The universe was being demolished right before his eyes because of his selfishness, and he was being forced to watch, unable to blink, let alone look away. Time and space are the same thing, and for all his brilliance he could not fathom a way to engineer a device capable of rendering one malleable without the other. He thought and thought and thought, and had finally decided that he could not predict the outcome of reshaping time without precedence, and that the objections voiced from within were centered on this same unknown factor. The results he had justified have as likely a chance of being successful and harmful as they do of being successful in bringing calamity. Either way, my objective is achieved. But calamity it was. He had stopped time, stopped motion, and stopped the expansion of space. The effect rippled away from him as he stayed nested in his device through the cosmos, halting first the Earth and her moon, then on throughout the solar system, and on through and beyond the galaxy to neighboring galaxies and the reaches beyond. In his slowed state of existence, to him it seemed to have happened at the speed of light and took an agonizingly long time, on the order of tens of billions of years. The way he saw it, the cessation of time splintered away from him and spread throughout the observable universe and beyond to the far limits of existence, and it did so like a wave and at light speed. In reality, this happened in a veritable instant. That's what he had done. He had broken time in the sense that his device had allowed for faster-than-light communication, balancing this by slowing the experience of the device itself and any occupant to a rate where this is done not in violation of natural law. From the slowed perspective of Alexander, time was stopping for the contents of the universe. The way he observed it, the process seemed to take an eternity, but in reality it all happened in almost the same instant. For all else, everything outside of his craft, it was over before it started. This was the reverse of what should have happened. He had broken the laws of physics. By all rights, the plausible outcome of activating a device such as this would not slow down its own rate of time, but that's what it did. That's what it had to do. Alexander didn't think that the effects would be so pronounced, but he could not move despite the strength of his will. He was trapped, unable to look away, his all-knowing sight bearing witness to the horrors as the time ripple tore across the universe, bringing everything to a standstill, and he was flooded with remorse as the earth disintegrated in front of him, reacting to a second wave which then began the process of reversing time. Space and time are the same thing, and he could not render one malleable without the other. As he reversed time, he inverted space. He watched as Earth, his former home, atomized and collapsed until its very particles disintegrated and returned to their intangible energetic states, seeming to disappear from reality altogether. And he continued to watch as this second wave impacted the rest of everything as he fell through time. There was no perceptible indication that he was moving backward through time at all. There was nothing but the lagged observation of destruction in the fringes of the universe, destroyed by the whim of a man who had too much power and had no regard for life when weighed against his own desires. It would be asking a lot to pity such a creature. Nevertheless, he was doomed. The intent had been to maintain control over the device and allow only the outer casing itself to diverge in its rate of processes. But the slowed time had somehow leaked in. He was veritably frozen in position and could not control his rate of descent through time, nor instruct his device to return to its normal rate of time and surface in the present. Alexander was hurtling uncontrollably, irretrievably backward through time, and he was taking the whole of existence with him. As the last intangible energetic remnants of the universe funneled in toward him and the final reaches of space itself collapsed around him, he couldn't even blink, still in his frozen state. He'd finally reached the beginning of time, As the moment passed, he and his craft disappeared, and Alexander found himself nowhere. Alexander was alone and outside of time. He no longer existed, and yet he did. Lyelin 11.2, May 1st, 1970 AD. It was confirmed. Not only could Justine see through the eyes of others, she could tell the future. Not very far into the future, true, but enough to wow her friends. She was not afraid of her abilities anymore, and in her own words even confessed, "I'm kinda digging this now." 11 seconds, they had counted. It was 9 yesterday. She could see 11 seconds into the future now, and she'd been delighting her classmates and friends by counting down to the random chirping of birds heard through the cracked window, as well as any other sudden, otherwise unpredictable random sounds like that of a door shutting in the adjacent hallway or words that carried around the corner from unseen sources. There were only 4 others in the class with her, 2 boys like her who were completely blind, and 1 girl and another boy who were legally blind but could still perceive indiscriminate light. She was the only one of them who had any memory of being able to see properly, as she had only been blinded 4 years earlier when a disease process stole her sight. The fact was that Justine was living on borrowed time. The same unidentified disease that robbed her of her vision was slowly eating away at her nervous system. Within a few years' time, she would become fully debilitated and die. The doctors of the time had no way of anticipating what would happen to her, and for the time she showed no outward signs that the disease was progressing. She was not in pain. Yet. The teacher announced that it was time to begin, and the children one by one stifled their laughter and readied themselves, shifting in their seats to face their braille machines. As she began to speak, she was stopped in her tracks when she looked to see Justine staring her in the face. Mrs. Schwartz was no sucker, and she was fully convinced that Justine's little tricks were just that, tricks. Now, looking her in the eye, she reconsidered her assumption that Justine had simply found some clever way of making it seem that she can do as she claims, and thought there to be no harm in testing it for herself. A moment ago, she had been ready to address the class with instruction, but she paused, and instead of her usual, "Good morning, class," that precedes every day's lesson, she instead said, "Okay, Justine, how many fingers am I holding up?" "2," she immediately and correctly responded. The class giggled. Roy, the assistant teacher, shrugged his shoulders and shook his head, silently communicating to her that he didn't know how she was doing it either. "All right," she said. "What does the poster behind me say?" "I don't know, you're not looking at it," she said. Then, "Oh, got it. Cute. It says, 'Just hang in there,' with a picture of a kitty hanging from a tree branch." "Preposterous," Mrs. Schwartz scoffed. "I didn't even look at it." "No, but Roy did." And she pointed directly at Roy, who had in fact looked at the poster behind Mrs. Schwartz when it was inquired about, and Justine locked her eyes squarely with his. "Whoa," Roy couldn't help but saying. "This can't be real." "No, it cannot," agreed Mrs. Schwartz. Then she addressed little 12-year-old Justine, who again squarely returned her gaze. "I trust that however you are doing this, it will not lead to any disruptions in my class, young lady, and... oh my God, you're bleeding." Justine saw it too, looking at herself through Mrs. Schwartz's eyes. The crotch of her pants was turning a dark red as blood steadily pooled and soaked through. She was having her first period. Mrs. Schwartz instructed Roy to retrieve the school nurse, and then crouched in front of her desk, patting the girl's hand in consolation. Justine let out a little embarrassed whimper and felt very uncomfortable in her skin, uncertain as to what she should do. No sooner had Roy rounded the corner than a massive shadow appeared in the doorway. It moved without making a sound and was completely undetected as it slowly crept up behind the teacher. In 11 seconds, she would turn around and see it. And foreseeing this, Justine suddenly gasped in fear and managed to say in a tremulous voice between forced breaths, "Look out! Behind you!" Mrs. Schwartz only caught a brief glimpse of the giant and had only enough time to want to scream before it snapped her neck with a squelching crack. Then Justine was again blind, as there were no other operable eyes in the room. She remained as clueless as to the monster's whereabouts as did the other children. The other 4 children had slowed their breathing, collectively straining to hear what was happening in the room and surmise the fate of their teacher. All but Justine. She was uncontrollably hyperventilating, squirming in the small pool of blood that was smearing across her chair. Then she began to calm herself. She foresaw that in 11 seconds she would be awash with peace and calm, though she did not understand why. In 10 seconds, the creature would say a word with which she was not familiar and gently touch her temples. In 9 seconds, 8. She would not be afraid whatsoever, almost as though this thing were her friend. 7, 6. In 5 seconds, she would somehow undergo a change. 4, 3. In 2 seconds, she would hear the monster say it, whatever it means. Roy could be heard down the hall, and she at the last second thought to call out for him, but before she could make a sound, she heard it. "Hello, Lylin," said Hemhut, as he touched his fingertips to her temples. Then Justine was gone. Lylin stood and threw her tiny arms around just above his waist, which was as high up as she could reach, given their difference in size. "Hello, Hemhut. It is as it should be. I cannot see," she said simply. "I know, my love," he said, as they released their embrace. "You will have to see for me from now on," she said. Then Hemhut looked toward the doorway. Roy had come into the room with the school nurse in tow. They both stood frozen with fear at the sight of Hemhut. Roy actually urinated in his pants where he stood when the great grey giant gestured to them and asked Lylin, "Them?" His voice was an intimidatingly gravelly mixture of impossibly deep tones. "Yes, I am sorry." She shook her head apologetically and said, "Both of them and no more, and it is done, and we are done." Then she looked at Roy with her blind eyes, seeing hers through his, and said to Hemhut, standing next to her, "At least I got to see you one last time. Do it and let us away." He needn't say another word nor have another said to him. He had his instructions. In a flash he had them both. They died relatively painlessly, that is to say that their pain did not last for long. Hemhut dispatched Roy and the nurse with the ease of having done nothing at all, leaving them in a crumpled heap piled together. Then Lylin, dwarfed by the giant in Justine's little 12-year-old body, took Hemhut by the hand, and together they walked out of the school, leaving the 4 blind children crying and scared in a classroom with 3 mangled bodies and a pool of blood creeping toward their trembling feet. There was no semblance of Justine remaining in her body, and Lylin had no love for her former classmates, but she knew how much Hemhut disdained the killing of children, so she spared them. They hadn't seen anything, and that was what was important. They heard things, but nothing that would alarm Daniel Dwyer should he peer into their memories. The whole thing would be dismissed, especially since all 4 of the blind children were doomed to die before the demon. Therefore, there was not much need for worry. For though Daniel could see through the eyes of others and into their memories, he was not so astute in life. It wasn't until after he had died that he found clarity enough to understand what he was experiencing. Lylin and Hemhut disappeared from view, obscured by the surrounding trees just as screams were heard from the open window of the classroom, and the gardener, who might have otherwise caught sight of them, looked up toward the noise. Lylin had a knack for timing things perfectly. Her future was unfolding in just the way it should. All of the pieces were falling into place, and finally there was nothing more that needed to be done. Finally they would have their moment in peace.